Hello everybody and welcome to this edition of the Wisdom of the World show. My name is Jack Butler and the Wisdom of the World show is where we bring you ideas from the world's leading minds, hearts and souls. Today my guest is David Loy. David's a professor, writer and Zen teacher in the Sambo Kaidan Japanese Zen Buddhist tradition. He's on the editorial or advisory boards of several journals and several organisations, including Global Buddhist Relief and Zen Peacemakers. I've actually got that the wrong way around. Buddhist Global Relief and Zen Peacemakers. He lectures nationally and internationally on various topics, focusing primarily on the encounter between Buddhism and modernity. He's especially concerned about social and ecological issues. He's a prolific author, including A Buddhist History of the West, Studies in Lack, Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes for a Buddhist Revolution, and his latest book, The World is Made of Stories. He offers workshops, leads meditation retreats, and lives with his partner here in Boulder, Colorado. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jack. Feels good to be here.
Great to have you here. Let's kick off with a little bit of backstory, if that's okay.
Sure.
I know that you travelled quite extensively as a young man, and then devoted a lot of your life to to spiritual teaching and then Buddhist exploration. Like, what got you into Buddhism? Why was that where you ended up?
Well, I'm obviously another child of the 60s, another boomer, and of course a lot of changes happened in the 60s. One of the important ones, of course, was political. The Vietnam War woke a lot of us up to the fact that we couldn't really trust what our government was saying.
Yes.
The world is rather different than we thought it was. So that was one side of it, a kind of an awakening there. But also I think the kind of revolution of the 60s, the fact that we experience the world in the way that we do, and that it's possible to experience the world in different sorts of ways.
Yes.
I think that's what led to sort of the Buddhist boom of the 70s, that people, and especially I think some of it too had to do with psychedelics.
Yes.
When you take something like acid or mushrooms, what happens is it's not that you feel different, it's that the world becomes different.
Yes.
It transforms for a while. And I think that was very, very important for a lot of us in the 60s, realizing that if our minds change, then the way that we experience the world is going to change.
Yeah.
And I think that was really what opened the door. People realized that psychedelics might give you a taste of it, but if you really want to delve deeply into that alternative, you need to get into a spiritual tradition and some kind of practice, serious practice.
Yeah. And where did that take you in world terms? Where did you study?
Well, when I graduated from college in '69, I became a draft resister, so I was out in the Bay Area,
right,
working with the San Francisco Draft Resistance Union for a while. And as the war wound down, I realized I need to sort of work more on myself. So initially I dropped out and started to go on a round-the-world trip with a friend. We got as far as the first stop, Hawaii, but we didn't have any money, so that's where we got stuck. Not a bad place.
I was going to say, yeah.
And that's also where I eventually, I had been reading a lot about Buddhism and Zen, and that's where I actually started to practice.
Okay. Yeah.
With the Diamond Sangha of Robert Aitken.
Right.
And actually my first retreat was with a visiting Japanese Zen master from Kamakura. And many years later I ended up going back to Japan and practicing, continuing the koan study with him.
Very good. So I know one of the areas of Buddhism that you're interested in, we talked about this intersection with modernity. Why is that particularly relevant area of inquiry for you?
The interaction with
between Buddhism and modernity. Yeah.
Well, one way to say it, I think, is both sides need a new story. I mean, I think what's happened in the modern world, sometimes we talk about the West, but it's really not the West anymore, is it? Because it's sort of globalized.
Yes.
Right? So what's happened in the modern world, I think, especially with the disappearance of God in the modern era, how this has left a kind of a void. I mean, God was the source of goodness, value, meaning, and so when he disappeared, it left a huge problem, which I think in a way has, science in certain ways hasn't been able to fill it very well. Although some scientists try to do so.
Yes.
I saw you had a couple of books by Richard Dawkins, for example.
Yes.
Yeah, and so what we really seem to have got caught up in is a kind of social Darwinism as a kind of substitute morality, and but from a Buddhist standpoint, that's simply a kind of rationalization or justification of some very problematical motivations like greed, aggression, delusion of a separate self, that can pursue its own benefit, indifferent to the well-being of others. So that's on the Western side. I think that's in a way where we're stuck. But also on the Buddhist side, for example, remembering that Buddhism originated as kind of an Iron Age religion in India.
Yes.
And so it's mythological in all kinds of ways that we need to question. So I think now that Buddhism comes to the West and the West comes to Buddhism, we're at a time of this very fascinating dialogue between the two, where each can interrogate the other and really ask what truth does the other have that we can learn from. And I think that's the stage we're at now.
So just as an example of that, it sounds like you're talking about a dialogue that modernity can learn from Buddhism and vice versa.
Right.
What's something that you think Buddhism can learn from modernity?
Well, one way to look at that is to look at the different ideals of the two traditions. I mean, I think when you look at the Western tradition, I think our highest ideal coming out of the Hebrew prophets and also the Greek realization that society can be restructured. I think the highest ideal that's come out of that is the concern for social justice. And the realization that we can restructure
the social order,
the economic order, the political order, in order to make it better. And I think this has been wonderful. I think we've had, a fair amount of success in certain ways. You think of human rights, civil rights, anti-slavery, gay liberation, etc. I mean,
come a long way.
The freedom of the individual has certainly come a long way. But we're also in a situation, I think, where we can see how there are limitations built into that. I mean, one way to say it is that you could have the most perfect economic and political system possible, but if the people in that system are still motivated by what Buddhism calls the three poisons, greed, ill will, delusion, then you're still going to have a lot of problems. You're going to have, the system won't work very well. People will try to take advantage of it, or try to take advantage of others outside the system, imperialism and so forth. So I think we can see certain inherent limitations in the Western tradition that if your understanding of freedom is freedom from external determination, if you don't also have some insight into your own ego, into your own motivations, that freedom isn't really going to give you happiness. It's not going to really give you what you want.
Yes.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But then if you look at it on the other side, if you look at the Buddhist, Buddhism, the Buddha talked about dukkha.
Yes.
Right? And he said all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it, right? Suffering.
Yeah.
But the way that's been understood in the Buddhist tradition, of course, is our own individual, personal dukkha.
Yes.
Understanding how our minds work, how we make ourselves unhappy in certain ways.
Yes.
And in a way, that's all that Buddhism could do in Asia, because those were non-democratics. They're very
highly hierarchical. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think in the modern world, we're very aware now how much dukkha is caused by institutional forms, and I think we have an opportunity then to bring together, what this great tradition of Buddhism has discovered about how the sense of self works, how it arises, how it creates problems for itself.
Yes.
And the importance of overcoming those three poisons. Bring that together with the Western emphasis on social transformation and social justice. So we need personal transformation and social transformation together if we want real freedom, for example.
Yes.
So I think that's one example of
how they come together. Yeah, it sounds like you're saying an interior consciousness has to be, ideally would be met by a institutional and structural design or consciousness, so that we're the inner world is the highest it can be, and our outer organising structures are the highest consciousness or frequency they can be.
And traditionally in Asian societies, of course, the focus has been only on the personal or the individual
Yes.
transformation. And I think we're at a point in history, given the kind of crises that we're facing today, where that,
Yeah, that narrative is now limited.
exactly,
Yeah.
well said.
Yeah. So I know that one of the things I enjoyed, when I was looking around your various writings, you talked about a version of Buddhism which is almost, leave me to my enlightenment, leave me to my meditation cushion. So how do you best go about engaging with that person or that version of Buddhism to say that perhaps there is a responsibility or an obligation, I don't know if you'd use those words, but to engage socially and to be part of the solution?
Very interesting question. I think that speaks to a kind of ambiguity in the Buddhist tradition, which is even more problematical in some of the other traditions, like the Abrahamic, the Christian, the Jewish, where often there's understood to be a kind of duality between this reality and some other higher one.
Yes.
And as if the goal is to sort of escape this world of samsara, suffering,
Yes.
Buddhism talks about, and sort of go up to some other dimension.
Yes.
And
almost like a heaven-earth kind of
exactly.
dualism.
Well, but I think that's another version of the same sort of thing, kind of cosmological dualism. Some people have talked about it. And along with that, of course, then is the idea of individual salvation.
Right.
Or individual awakening, that, okay, well, then the focus is upon my realizing, my attaining that other reality. And the danger there, of course, is the kind of duality where it suggests a kind of indifference to what's going on with this world as a whole, and certainly with other people. In other words, I can have my own full awakening with indifference or lack of concern for what's going on with other people. In fact, I think that kind of cosmological duality is something we have to outgrow. I mean, I think there's a metaphorical or a symbolic meaning that's very important, talking about different ways of experiencing this world. So in that sense, by pointing to another way of experiencing, that's essential. But the idea that in a way we run away from this reality is very dangerous. The way that I like to talk about it, therefore, is to talk about the fundamental problem as this sense of a self that's separate from the rest of the world. And I think that's what Buddhism, for example, is getting at when it talks about the relationship between dukkha, suffering, and anatta, not self. Right?
Not self. Okay.
So you could say that in more contemporary terms, our sense of a separate self, it's a psychological and social construction, such as Western psychologists know, right?
Yes.
So if we understand Buddhism in this way, and there's all kinds of words in the early Buddhist tradition about construction. It's not a matter of talking about this world as illusory or unreal. Rather, it's the emphasis that we experience the world in the way that we do because it's been constructed. The sense of self is constructed. The sense of the externality or objectivity of the world separate from us.
Yes.
That sense of duality is a construct. And being a construct, it can be deconstructed and reconstructed. So if you understand it in these terms, awakening isn't transcending the world. The problem is there's a sense in which we already transcend it. We feel separate from it. That's the problem. The idea is the kind of opening up so that we realize that we're one of the many manifestations of this world.
Yes.
And I think if we understand the awakening in that way, then we can see more naturally the kind of social implications of it. That insofar as I realize that I'm not somewhere inside here, separate from you and separate from other people, but that I'm all of this. I'm simply one of the ways that all this comes together right here and now. Then naturally, if this is what I am, then I'm naturally going to be concerned about the well-being because it's me. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's this great quotation from Nisargadatta, the Advaitin teacher that I quote rather too much, where he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, it's love. Between these two, my life turns." And I think that's really it, the two wings, right?
Yes.
The two wings of the Dharma, wisdom and love. Love is simply love is the way that we live according to the insight that we're not separate from other people. Something like that.
So if I've understood, if you like, your definition of realization, I think you might use different language, but which is the ability to see this self as constructed and to see that there is no fundamental separation between me and the world, or the inner and the outer. So I have a question about that. Is it possible for people to live permanently from that place, from that realized state, or that realization? What's your own experience of that? Your own journey, and obviously you've taught a lot of people.
Well, again, going back to those two realities, two truths that Buddhism and Vedanta sometimes talk about. I mean, usually we're stuck. I mean, our problem is that we understand ourselves to be separate from all the other things. We understand our world to be a collection of separate things in space and time. One of them is us.
Yes.
And one of them, this one in particular, bothers us because we have a sense of our mortality, So if that's where we start, then of course naturally the spiritual traditions emphasize getting some taste, some glimpse of this other way of experiencing the world that I was trying to refer to. But there's different degrees. It's like you can have a taste.
Yes.
But okay, if the Kensho, if the awakening is a kind of a letting go, the ego self letting go of itself, still it reconstitutes, right? It's only a glimpse. It's not as though that has really resolved anything in itself. So the idea is through practice to have deeper experiences, or more to clarify that experience and to understand more clearly what it really means, and then to sort of, not sure how best to say this, but to bring these two dimensions together.
Yes.
Right? So it's not simply a matter of bouncing back and forth between them, but rather living in such a way that they are integrated, or that they are seen as really two aspects of the same thing, which is what they are.
Yes. And is that just a question of years and practice?
Well, for most of us.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, obviously there are people in some traditions, or even outside of tradition, who seem to have this sort of experience spontaneously.
Yes.
But for most of us, I think it takes some effort to sort of let go of these habitual ways of thinking and feeling that are reinforcing the sense of separateness, that are reinforcing the self-preoccupation, or even narcissism. Now that practice in itself, meditation doesn't guarantee anything, right? It doesn't lead to enlightenment. But as Trungpa said, meditation does make you accident prone.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It reminds me, there's several sporting analogies like that, which, it's like, my game soccer, strikers saying that, the more you put yourself in the right place, the more headers or the more goals you seem to get, and people only notice it when it comes off. Right. What they don't notice is all the times that you ran into that spot and nothing happened. But the more you practice, the luckier you get. So from that place, is it always the case that in realizing a non-separateness from the other, that do you think compassion necessarily arises from that?
Well, maybe put it the other way around, that our lack of compassion, that is to say our self-preoccupation, is the result of a pretty basic ignorance or delusion about who I really am.
Right.
So as one begins to let go and see through that delusion of separation, the self-preoccupation based upon that also tends to weaken.
Yes.
And become less. And so in that way, indirectly, or to say it another way, when I realize that my true self is not, something in here behind the eyes or
Yes.
inside here, but this is my, all of this is my true self. When I really realized that, well, compassion isn't about helping somebody else, it's like taking care of my own leg, because I'm not separate from all this. And so how can I pursue my own well-being, indifferent to the well-being of others? It's just not possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you okay?
I'm all right. I
Sure?
have a bit of a back problem, but it's okay.
Okay.
Comes and goes.
So I just want to dig into that just a little bit, because I've heard people say, it's just like taking care of another part of my body. Like, is that a lived reality for you? Like, is that a sort of metaphor, or is it almost like that?
I wouldn't necessarily want to set myself up as the ideal example to be followed here, if that's what you mean. But I think
just for people who are saying that's interesting. I'd like to experience my life in that way. That looking after my hand is the same thing as looking after someone else.
Well, yes and no. There's still a sense, right, that your leg is different from my leg. Your back is different than my back.
Yes.
And so the kinds of responsibility that I have to your back.
Yes.
And my back are somewhat different, right?
Uh-huh.
So don't want to confuse.
Yes.
Don't want to confuse that level either. There's still a sense of. David Loy still has to take care of this body and this life as in order, but I think what it really comes down to is maybe a different understanding about the meaning of one's life, really. Maybe that's the term, right? Because insofar as we have this sense that, I'm separate, and as I said, I can, look out for number one without giving a damn about anybody else, the meaning is focused on what's supposedly best for this separate person here. But as this illusion or delusion diminishes, then it can come down to this okay, what is going to be the meaning of my life, and dependent upon the kind of person I have, the qualities, the education, the possibilities built into that, and seeing myself in the context of what's going on. And it's always this question, not what can I get out of this situation, or even how can I escape this situation, but rather, what can I do to make this situation better? Something like that.
Yes.
So again, not a sense of non-duality that denies, the particular form of this body or the need to take care of it, but nonetheless this larger purpose, the larger meaning of one's life is not trying to pursue the benefit of some being here separate from
what's going on,
from the larger thing that's going on.
Yeah.
Look, we're all going to, if we're lucky, we're all going to get old and die. So what? We can't take it with us, right?
Yeah.
So at a certain point, it's important to see through those games and kind of turn around this question of meaning.
Yeah.
Make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I want to just punch into something else quickly, which is it strikes me that there can be a risk. I'm sure I'm not the first person to suggest this, that people who get very into the spiritual journey and very into non-attachment, that there could be a risk that can lead to a lack of accountability or a lack of interest in results. So I'm sure a number of the people in this audience are entrepreneurial or social entrepreneurs or change agents or conscious change agents, as I call them. So people who have certainly are focusing a lot of their lives on making the world better or making a difference. How do you keep the level of engagement with wanting to make things better in a way that you see, or bringing a vision into the world, whilst also being completely unattached to that? Should it work out differently than you suspect. So, and how do you do that? Even in something like a diet, where it's like, okay, you know, you think I want to get, you know, my body to this size, or I want to be this weight. That it seems quite black and white whether you hit a particular goal or not. We can measure it. Yeah, how do you do that in a way that allows for non-attachment?
Well, the only answer I can give to that is to sort of restate the problem in a way. You know, we talked about those two dimensions.
Yes.
Another way of talking about it, such as the Heart Sutra says, is to see. I mean, you can say we're stuck in the dimension of form. The world is a collection of separate forms, and how important it is to see their emptiness, in using Buddhist language. But it's not simply that form is empty. Rather, we have to realize that emptiness takes form.
Yes.
And so these are again. This is talking about integrating the two dimensions.
Yes.
In a way, I think this points to what may be the most distinctive and the most important contribution of the Buddhist tradition to the kind of critical situation that we find ourselves in today.
Right.
Obviously, ecologically, economically, etc.
Yeah, we're going to get onto that.
Okay. Well, it's the idea of the bodhisattva. I think we need to understand the bodhisattva path now in terms of kind of social activism as well, not just somebody helping somebody else awaken.
Yes.
But
what's the specific meaning of the bodhisattva actually?
Literally, a bodhisattva, bodhi means awakened mind, and sattva being. So a being with an awakened mind.
Okay.
Right. And so what it's really pointing at is somebody who's pretty deeply awakened and yet doesn't, this is the mythology, doesn't choose to sort of disappear completely to nirvana, but rather makes a commitment or a vow to stick around and help the rest of us become awakened. Yeah. I think we really need some modified conception of this today. Modified in the sense that this way of presenting the bodhisattva's activity suggests it's a kind of sacrifice on his or her part. I don't think it's really a sacrifice. I think it's simply a higher stage of practice that as you start to sort of overcome your self-preoccupation, how do you do that? How do you overcome these mostly habitual ways of self-centered thinking and feeling? You do it by engaging in more compassionate, more selfless activity. But what's really intriguing about the bodhisattva is that he or she continues to work on both levels. That is to say, they're still working on their own awakening, their own meditation practice. They still have their own individual personal transformation. That it's not as though there's the understanding that that's finished or anything. That's going on. But at the same time, they're involved in action in the world to make the world a better place, which in our time calls not just for helping others meditate or awaken, but it really means addressing the larger institutional challenges that we face now. The role of fossil fuel corporations and I think a very problematical economic system generally. So the bodhisattva works on both levels. And it's interesting how that puts together the old idea of form and emptiness, that the bodhisattva realizes form as emptiness, that's the personal transformation, but also realizes that one can't simply stop there. I mean, if we're really going to address the Buddha's concern, suffering in the very broadest sense, well, it's not just our own suffering. Right? I mean, when we begin to awaken, we awaken from our own self-obsession, the suffering involved in that, and become aware of the suffering of the world. And I think there's this natural concern then to find the best ways to, how do we address that? I think that's the challenge. So the bodhisattva, when you're in the world, I mean, obviously you have to be concerned about consequences, right? If you're in politics, you're trying to achieve something. And inevitably, though, there's going to be all kinds of frustration. You're not going to get what you want, or you only get a piece of it, and so forth. That's why the other side of the bodhisattva's practice is so important, the realization that the bodhisattva acts out of this place of emptiness where there's nothing to gain, nothing to lose, nowhere to go. There's nothing lacking. The bodhisattva resides in that place, But that's only the form is emptiness. The Bodhisattva also realizes that in this world, there's lots that needs to be done, and so it's this two-sidedness that I think is so important. Especially because activists otherwise, burn out so easily. They get so frustrated, and I think the Bodhisattva's practice can keep that from happening.
So it's not an inattention to results. It's just coming from this deeper perspective that you said there's nothing to lose, there is nothing to gain. It's hard to hold that. It seems that there would be few people that can really be fully engaged in the world and at the same time just say, well, what's arising will arise, and it's sort of like, how do you take responsibility for the present moment and surrender to it at the same time?
Exactly, yeah, and that's why the Bodhisattva's personal practice, that is to say, meditation, is so essential.
Yeah.
Because I think it's not possible to keep that tension or to hold the two together unless one has that kind of practice as well.
Support it, yeah.
So the non-attachment to results is not indifference to what's going on to the earth, for example.
Yes.
But it's the realization that one acts, one doesn't know what's going to come out of that. Just one doesn't give up, one keeps doing what one can. Not knowing, this is the other side of it, not knowing if anything that one does is going to make any difference whatsoever. Not knowing. And yet, from a Buddhist perspective, from a Zen perspective, not knowing, as we say, is very deep.
Yes.
We don't know. There's a mystery here. We don't know what's possible, we don't know what the larger consequences of our efforts are going to be, but we do it anyway. Because the more we wake up, the more we overcome our own self-preoccupation, the more we realize that's the only game in town. What else is worth doing? What else is important?
Yeah. So let's have a look at some of this suffering in the world, because I know this is something that's of concern to you. You talked a little bit about the three poisons. I'm curious what your sense is of how those poisons are institutionalized in society, and whether you can perhaps give one or two examples of if that's the case, where you see that being the case.
Right. Well, I think this is a good instance of how it is that the Buddhist insight into the sources of our own individual suffering can give us very important insight into the larger collective or the institutionalized suffering. Right. Yeah. So, to say it again, the three poisons are usually translated as greed, ill will, or aggression, and delusion, right? And it seems to me, today we're confronted with a situation that the Buddha didn't have, that in his time, it's not only the case that science and technology was so much less, but also institutions.
Yes.
And I think we can see that institutionally, the kind of economic system we have, which emphasizes that consumers never consume enough, corporations are never profitable enough, market share is never big enough, the GDP is never big enough. Well, if you define greed as never enough, then it seems to me our economic system is institutionalized greed. And as I think we're all seeing now, a system that depends on perpetual indefinite growth, if it's not to collapse, such as our present economic system, which I call consumer corporate capitalism, that's incompatible with the well-being of the earth, which is a very finite system, and of course which is being much damaged by this sort of preoccupation. So that's one example. Another example, especially pertinent here in the United States, of course, is institutionalized aggression would be our militarism.
Yes.
Yeah. I got a letter from the American Friends Service Committee a few months ago pointing out that if you include the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, last year the United States military spent approximately $1,165,907,000,000 on its military. Huge.
Yeah, almost.
We're a very militarized society, And it's interesting in all the budget reductions and the way that people talk about the problems with social security and debt and all this, people don't really look at, our number one expense, which is to say our military.
Mm.
And then the third example would simply be institutionalized delusion. Well, I think that's our media, really. Especially in the United States, where, the primary concern of the media as large, major corporate realities is that they're not concerned about educating or informing us. Their fundamental concern, of course, is making money from advertising. That is to say, perpetuating a certain kind of worldview where it's the next thing that you buy is going to make you happy. So I see these three, and just as on the individual level that they work together, greed, ill will, delusion, so I think we can see them also reinforcing each other institutionally as well.
Yes.
Those three, our economic system, our militarism, and our media are really part of the same network. But when the Buddha identifies these as the roots of evil, that's kind of scary then. Have we institutionalized the roots of evil? Pretty intimidating.
So if someone's looking at this and they're like, yeah, I agree with you, I can see that military spending is huge, the consumer agenda of happy faces in advertising and beautiful models who don't really exist because they're sometimes concoctions of, and also sometimes there's a number of people put into one picture. So if I see that as a problem, what as as an individual or as an activist, what do you recommend as the best way to be part of something better?
I don't see the implication of something like Buddhism as encouraging us to sort of go out and form a new political movement or a new political party. I mean, there are already a large number of movements, a large number of organizations. I think it was Paul Hawken who pointed out in his last book,
Blessed Unrest.
Blessed Unrest, how there's between 1 million and 2 million.
Some actual staggering,
number.
Many millions of organizations. Yeah.
Something that's never happened before, right?
Right.
And these aren't organized, it's not a communist conspiracy, they're kind of the grassroots. And I think it's reflecting a change of consciousness, that is happening. So the real important contribution of something like Buddhism and other non-dualist traditions is I think, to play a role within them. As I was saying, I think a lot of that role can be helping people appreciate more the importance of personal transformation, bringing that in. You see, it's like on the other side, so many of the movements for social transformation come out of the left, naturally.
Yes.
Which is traditionally very wary of religion for good reason.
Yes.
Right? You look at the French Revolution, the way that the
Yes.
church was part of the problem, not the solution. Right?
Yes.
So what I think can happen and needs to happen now is this deeper understanding of what it means to be spiritual and how well this can fit in, as in the case of the Bodhisattva path, with the kind of social activism that's so necessary today. So on a personal level, I think we need to find ways to get in touch with the movements that really speak to us most deeply. Right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it'll be different things for different people, but that's where your passion is going to be, whether it would be climate change or women's issues or poverty or militarism. I mean, you name it.
It's not like a choice of things to happen.
Exactly. Or fracking.
Yeah.
Right? Here in the Boulder area. Huge.
Yeah. Do you just want to quickly explain what that is for people?
Fracking is this new tendency now to basically use chemicals and explosive devices to sort of liberate oil and gas, especially gas under the ground. But there's all kinds of ecological problems with it. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of different ways that one can go. I think you really have to feel what speaks to you and also where you're in a position to really be able to do something about it.
Yes.
I mean, one group, for example, that really speaks to me is 350.org. Bill McKibben's group working against climate change and global warming. And I think they're doing wonderful work. And I think we're getting to the point where we also have to consider the importance, probably the necessity, of something like civil disobedience. Just like we were doing in the late 60s with the anti-Vietnam War, and really had an impact. I think it helped to bring that war to an end. Likewise, I think we're going to have to, I mean, the higher up you go on the governmental level, the more unresponsive and sort of obscenely ignoring they are in this country regarding something like climate change. And I think we're going to have individuals sort of taking that commitment to sort of engage in nonviolent protests that really kind of clog up the system by refusing to let the fossil fuel corporations sort of continue what they're doing.
Yeah. Is social transformation and personal transformation, is that something that always needs to kind of come together? I mean, you've said that this seems to be one of the best times in history to, not only are all the tools of a number of spiritual traditions available to people, so you can find, a context and a kind of texture that really works for you. And not only are there so many social initiatives that one could get involved with that seem to be, about furthering our collective possibility. Are you saying necessarily that people need to be involved in both sides of that equation?
I think that we're at a very special time in history. Maybe people always think that, but it's becoming very clear now, especially in terms of climate issues, ecological issues, that the decisions we make in the next few years as a species could have ramifications for thousands of years for not only the human species, but for many life forms on this planet.
Yes.
We already know how we're into the 6th great extinction event, where some biologists are predicting that half of the plant and animal species on Earth could disappear by the end of this century, or be so weak that they would disappear somewhere. I mean, this is shocking. This is, okay, I mean, we really have to digest what this means, and one way to say it is, when we do so, we can see that the Earth, there's something calling upon us to take this next step. I think if we're, if we can become a little bit less preoccupied with our own consumerism, or even spiritual consumerism, spiritual materialism, then we can feel, we can hear this call.
Yes.
And I think the Earth needs more and more of us to do this. So part of the crisis, this is a crisis not only for modernity and what we've done, this is a crisis for the spiritual traditions that are being challenged, I think, to take it to a next level, to mature further, to be able to overcome this delusion of a private salvation, personal salvation, and realize that we're all in it together, we're all part of the same thing.
Yes. So where do you personally stand as you look to the future? I mean, you've said there are some pretty grave issues that we face, and there could be some even more grave consequences if they're not faced up in the right way. So, what's your own personal flavour towards that? Do you believe that we have in our own capabilities the tools and the consciousness to meet these challenges? Or are you slightly more pessimistic when it comes to climate change and nuclear and militarism and some of the things that you've touched in on?
Well, the tools, the things that are needed, I suspect they're all already here. Even in terms of alternative forms of energy, I expect we know enough now that we could make that transition, start to make that transition pretty seriously right now. Now, whether we will or not, because of institutionalized forces against us, I don't know. I mean, in a way you're asking, am I optimistic or pessimistic? I think there's a sense in which both of those are a kind of evasion from the challenge of the present moment. You know, optimism is, yeah, things are going to get better. Pessimism, things are going to get worse. Well, that sort of reduces a little bit our agency, our responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think it's really a case of, well, going back to this don't know, not knowing, our job is to do the very best that we can, not knowing what's going to come out of it.
Well, let's look forward to seeing what emerges and being part of what can emerge.
Yeah. Thank you for this discussion.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for spending time with me today. I've enjoyed it. Cheers. Thank you.